By the time of The Lord of the Rings, the Horse Lords of Rohan have been ruled by 17 different kings. Some of them were great, some were not, but there is one king in particular who stands out among the rest. This is the story of Helm Hammerhand. Maya Govan and Melanine, and welcome to another episode of Tolkien Untangled. Today's video is all about, arguably, the most iconic king that Rohan ever had. And the reason I'm making this video right now is to coincide with the release of the animated film War of the Rohirrim. However, that film's not out yet as of recording, so this isn't a review, it's just an in-depth exploration of what Tolkien wrote about this character and his family and this moment in Rohan's history, in Middle-earth's history. So, is that a spoiler warning for the film? I don't know. I guess it depends how faithful the adaptation is. But I will say the vast majority of what Tolkien wrote about Helm Hammerhand can be found in The Lord of the Rings Appendix A. And the grand total of all that material concerning Helm covers 2 pages. What Tolkien wrote is a brief overview of a historical conflict. There is no Helm Hammerhand novel to talk about. There are 11 paragraphs. Those paragraphs are fascinating, and because it's Tolkien we're talking about, there is an enormous richness to them. They inspire the imagination and allude to an enormously wide world, but I do think it's important to state the sparseness of this story. If you think some of the characters are a little underwritten, that's because they only exist in a couple of sentences. And yet, you'll notice this is not a short video. The tale of Helm Hammerhand is epic and tragic and very Anglo-Saxon. I have a lot to say about it, but when Tolkien wrote this, he wasn't writing a feature-length story, he was adding flavour to The Lord of the Rings. Anyway, without further ado, let's lay the groundwork of what's happening in Rohan before the reign of King Helm. And I guess the first thing to say is that relative to other realms and regions in Middle-earth, Rohan is really quite a young kingdom by the time of The Lord of the Rings. You know, when Frodo sets off to destroy the ring, the Shire is already 1,400 years old. Gondor is 3,300 years old, Rivendell is 4,700 years old, and Khazad-dûm is like 10,000. But Rohan? At the time of The Lord of the Rings, this kingdom has only existed for 500 years, and Helm Hammerhand was the 9th king of Rohan, so the entire story of his life takes place only about 260 years before The Lord of the Rings, only 183 years before The Hobbit. By Middle-earth standards, this is recent history. Obviously, the people of Rohan do have ancestors reaching back into the depths of time, all people do, but the kingdom of Rohan did not exist until a young horse lord called Eorl brought an army of riders to the aid of Gondor when Gondor's need was greatest. The first riders of Rohan, who back then called themselves the Eotheod, saved Gondor from total defeat. And because they did, their king, Eorl the Young, was granted the Gondorian lands of Calenarthon as a gift of gratitude. For most of the Third Age, Calenarthon was simply a northern province of Gondor, but in the year 2510 of the Third Age, Eorl the Young swore an oath of abiding friendship to the steward Cirion of Gondor, and from that day forward, Calenarthon belonged to the Horse Lords, to the Eotheod, who in the Elvish tongue of the Dunedain were called the Rohirrim. And this is a super important detail in Rohan's history, not just because it's like the founding moment of that kingdom, but also because it's the founding moment of an intensely important friendship. Eorl and Cirion, Rohan and Gondor, which will culminate in Theoden at the Battle of Pelennor Fields. Rohan exists because of Gondorian gratitude. Gondor was saved by the valor of the Horse Lords. Their realms are distinct and independent. You know, the kings of Rohan owe no fealty to the stewards of Gondor. They have their own laws and customs, but these two countries exist in a state of, to use Tolkien's exact words, perpetual alliance. The relationship between Rohan and Gondor is as wholesome as it is epic. Interesting side note though, originally the Rohirrim themselves did not refer to themselves as Rohirrim, nor did they at first call their lands Rohan. These words are of Sindarin, Elvish extraction, and they were used by the men of Gondor to denote the horse lords in their horse lands. That's what Rohan means. But originally, in their own language, the Rohirrim called themselves the Eorlingas, the people of Eorl, and they called their lands the Riddermark, or simply the Mark. There's a lot more to the story of Rohan's founding and the origins of the Eortheod, and it's awesome, but you guys clicked on this video to hear about Helm Hammerhand and the epic things he got up to, and although I'm basically addicted to providing context, I don't want to get too sidetracked with the early years of Rohan's history. So for now, I'll skip forward exactly 200 years from Rohan's first king, Eorl the Young, to their 7th king, a guy called Deor, the grandfather of Helm Hammerhand. And the reason I begin Helm's story with his grandfather, Deor, is because it was during the days of Deor that a long period of tentative peace came to an abrupt end. In Deor's day, the men of Dunland went to war. But first, who are the men of Dunland, the Dunlendings? Well, I think they're fascinating. The Dunlendings are the local inhabitants of this part of Middle-earth, Dunland. And although there have been men living here since the First Age, it's not really until the Second Age that we see evidence of a distinct Dunlending culture and language. Unfortunately though, for the men of Dunland, the Second Age was the Númenórean age, and when the Dúnedain of Númenor first landed here, they were really quite ruthless to the native Dunlendings. Many of them fled, some went north, some went south, and some went east. Interestingly, the descendants of the guys who fled north went on to become some men of Bree, and the men who went south are ancestors of the oath-breaking men of Dunharrow, whom Aragorn recruited 3,000 years later, which means Barlam and Butterbur of the Prancing Pony and the King of the Dead probably share some common ancestry thanks to the Second Age men of Dunland, albeit very distantly. However, it's the descendants of the men who fled east that matter right now. These people sought shelter in the foothills of the Misty Mountains, and some of them ventured into Calenarthon, the lands that will one day become Rohan. I guess the important thing to take away from Dunlending history, and one of the reasons I find them so interesting to think about, is that they are a very quote-unquote human group of people. You know, they aren't worshippers of the Dark Lord, they're not corrupted by rings of power. They are quite a recognizable group of Middle-earth men, who for reasons that are not entirely irrational, have developed a bitter dislike of the descendants of the Dúnedain living in Gondor. The same Dúnedain descendants who will go on to swear abiding friendship and perpetual alliance with the Eorlingas of the Riddermark, the Riders of Rohan. Unlike orcs and trolls and many other villains in Tolkien's writings, the people of Dunland are not servants of evil. They're also not particularly nice. They are just people, steeped in conflict with other people, stretching back to the days of their distant ancestors. Their wars with the Rohirrim, I think, have much more in common with real-world wars between the historical Celts and the Anglo-Saxons than they do with, like, the high fantasy conflicts between the Free Peoples and the Dark Lords that we might find in the Silmarillion. Anyway, in the long wars between the Dunlendings and the Rohirrim, there are two all-important locations that play a pivotal role over and over and over. Two fortresses, strongholds, both facing each other and standing only 75 miles apart. However, neither of these strongholds were built by men of Rohan nor by men of Dunland. They are both much, much older. You see, towards the end of the Second Age, just before the War of the Last Alliance, so thousands of years before Rohan is founded, the first Gondorians, using their Númenórean know-how, built two great fortresses to watch over the narrow stretch of land between the Misty Mountains and the White Mountains that they called the Gap of Calenarthon. 2,500 years later, when the first Rohirrim arrived and the Gap of Calenarthon became the Gap of Rohan, they found these ancient and enormous fortresses, and they were utterly in awe of them. It was said by the Rohirrim that these strongholds were built in far-off days by the sea kings of old with the hands of giants, and seemingly not made by the craft of men, but riven from the bones of the earth. Again, there's a real-world Anglo-Saxon connection here, because in actual history, when the Anglo-Saxons came to Britain and they found the stone ruins left by the ancient Romans, they also believed them to be the work of giants. Even though the Anglo-Saxons came hundreds of years after the ancient Roman Golden Age, the Roman method of building had by then become lost knowledge. The Anglo-Saxons marveled at what the ancients achieved, knowing that they themselves could not replicate it with their own methods and technology. That's the same way that the men of Rohan viewed the building work of the ancient Gondorians. Anyway, the reason I'm lingering on these two strongholds is because one of them will go on to be occupied by the Rohirrim, and the other will be occupied by Dunlendings. The ancient fortress to the south was built at the far end of a deep valley, and in the language of the Rohirrim it was called the Soothburg, the South Fortress. However, one day the horn of Helm Hammerhand shall ring out in the deep, and when it does, the Soothburg shall become known as the Hornburg, and this valley, Helm's Deep. I'll circle back to that. But before I do, there is the other ancient Gondorian outpost, the Iron Fortress of Angranost, 75 miles to the north of Helm's Deep. And if we were to translate Iron Fortress, or more literally Iron Enclosure, from modern English into Old English, the language of the real-world Anglo-Saxons, which Tolkien also translated the language of Rohan into, the word we would get is Isengard. I know Isengard is most often associated with the wizard Saruman, but for the first 2,800 years or so, it was a Gondorian stronghold, encircling a Gondorian tower containing a Gondorian palantir, right on the fringes of Gondor's territory. At least that was the case in theory. In reality, though, things were quite a bit more complex, because, let's not forget, Dunlendings. Honestly, the story of Isengard's place in Dunlending history could be the topic of its own video, but keeping things simple, in the 2,631 years between Gondor's founding and the coming of the Rohirrim, Gondor went into decline. The strength of the Dunedain waned, and following a great plague that emptied Calenarthon of people, eventually Isengard was neglected. By the second half of the Third Age, the impenetrable tower of Orthanc was shut. Its door was locked and its key returned to Minas Tirith. No one would set foot inside that tower again until the coming of Saruman many centuries later. And by then, the fact that Orthanc contained a palantir was mostly forgotten. However, just because the tower is locked does not mean that Isengard itself was totally abandoned. While Gondor's gaze was elsewhere, many men of Dunland, the ones living in the foothills of the Misty Mountains, came to Isengard, and they started to settle in the nearby lands. Their populations mixed with the last of the Gondorian garrisons, and as time wore on, the people of Isengard became more and more Dunlending. Which brings us to the year 2510 of the Third Age, the year in which it looked like Gondor might be completely destroyed by servants of Sauron, until Eorl the Young, king of the Eotheod, rode to Gondor's aid, and thus the kingdom of Rohan was founded. All of a sudden, the Dunlendings in Isengard had neighbours in Calenarthon. And this probably won't shock you, those two populations of men with different ancestors and different cultures, different histories, different languages, really did not get along. Dunlending raids against the Westfold became relatively common in the years that followed, and so too were reprisals from Rohan. But in the days of Eorl and his sons and his grandsons, the violence never really boiled into what we might call open war. However, all of that changed during the reign of Helm Hammerhand's grandfather, King Daor. In Daor's day, the Dunlendings struck back. They became openly hostile, and their attacks on the Westfold intensified. So Daor led an expedition into the Westfold, and there he defeated a great Dunlending host in battle, which meant, in his mind, victory. right? The Dunlendings were defeated. All Daor had to do now was ride to Isengard and liberate it from the last of his enemies. However, what Daor didn't realise is that Isengard wasn't so much besieged by Dunlendings as it was owned by them. A few years earlier, a group of particularly nasty Dunlendings came to Isengard, and although they were welcomed there as friends by the mixed population inhabiting it, these Dunlendings swiftly seized the fortress by force, and they murdered anyone and everyone who refused to join with them. By the time Daor arrived, there was nothing ambiguous about it. Isengard was a stronghold of Dunlendings. They shot at the king as he approached, and so Daor was forced to retreat. He kept a contingent of riders in the Westfold to resist Isengard's future raids, and he sent word to the steward of Gondor telling him what had happened. But unfortunately, Gondor had problems of its own at this time, and unless you're an Ent, Isengard is pretty impossible to conquer. So, despite King Daor's victory in the field, he ultimately failed to defeat the Dunlendings. And 8 years later, he died. The kingship of Rohan passed to his son, a guy called Gram, and throughout all of King Gram's reign, conflict with Dunlendings became the norm. However, the real reason why King Gram matters is because of his children. He had two, a son and a daughter. The daughter was called Hild, and the fact that she exists will become very important later in this story. But what we need to know right now is that Hild's older brother, Gram's heir, was called Helm, whom Tolkien described as a grim man of great strength. I'm aware I've taken my sweet time getting here, but I think it's important to establish that by the time Helm succeeded his father and became King of Rohan at the age of 50, war with the Dunlendings was already well underway. Anyway, at some point, Helm got married, and he and his wife had 3 children. A firstborn son, an heir, called Haleth, a second son, I guess a spare, called Hammer, and a daughter, whom Tolkien never named. Interestingly though, and very importantly, Helm also had a nephew, a sister son called Frealaf. Frealaf was the son of Hild, and he's actually remembered in Rohan's history as Frealaf Hilderson. Now, as it goes, we don't know anything about the family dynamics of Haleth and Hammer and their sister and their cousin Frealaf, but it's a cool thing to speculate on. I'm always fascinated by the younger generation of Royal Rohirrim who live their lives kind of in the shadow of King Helm, and I imagine the 4 of them would have a really tight familial bond. But the main character here is Helm Hammerhand himself, and you may be wondering, why exactly is this guy so famous? Most people, I'm guessing, haven't heard of King Daor or King Gram, but Helm Hammerhand needs no introduction. And how did he acquire that nickname? Well, this question brings us to one of the main villains in our story, a particularly nasty piece of work called Freca. Now, Freca is very interesting because his exact origins aren't the easiest thing to untangle. We know that he is, to a significant extent, a man of Rohan. He is in fact a lord of Rohan and a powerful landowner with holdings on either side of the river Adorn, which lies beyond the Gap of Rohan. And very interestingly, Freca claims to be descended from Helm's great-great-grandfather, Rohan's 5th king, a guy called Freawina. Now, goodness knows if that's true or not. Maybe Freca is simply lying about his heritage for the sake of claiming legitimacy, but either way, it paints an interesting picture. Freca is a guy who claims descent from Rohan's royalty, but he lives in and rules over lands that lie beyond the borders of that kingdom. He is considered a lord of Rohan, but he looks like a man of Dunland. Regardless of whether he really is a descendant of King Freawina, he definitely is a descendant of many Dunlendings. And just like many Dunlendings, Freca is no friend to Rohan's current king. His lands beside the Adorn are a long way from Helm's Golden Hall of Meduseld in Edoras, and for much of his life, Freca has been relatively independent. He's amassed a good amount of wealth, he's gained a fair degree of power, and he's done so without much oversight from the capital. It's true, King Helm often sent messengers summoning Lord Freca to attend royal councils. We're told Helm mistrusted Freca, But even so, Freca paid little heed to the king, and he only came to Meduseld when it behooved him to do so. Which brings us to the event that gets the whole rest of Helm's story rolling. The event that caused him to be called Hammerhand. So, in the year 2754, Lord Freca did something quite uncharacteristic. He rode to Edoras. He brought a great many men with him, and he actually attended one of King Helm's councils. But he had an ulterior motive for doing so. You see, among Freca's many men, there rode a great young warrior called Wulf. And Wulf was Freca's son. We don't know anything about Wulf's mother, so we can't break down the extent to which he was or was not a quote-unquote true man of Dunland, but through his father we can be certain Wulf must have had some mix of both Rohan and Dunlending heritage, as well as potentially some Gondorian blood. Now, the reason Freca and Wulf rode to Helm's council has nothing to do with fealty to their king, and everything to do with Freca's ambition and his agenda. You see, it's Freca's plan to fashion a marriage pact between his son Wulf and Helm's daughter, which would result in Freca's future grandchildren being able to claim descent not only from King Freowina through him and Wulf, but also they would be descendants of Helm, and Gram, and Daor, and all the other kings that came after Freowina. If Freca can get this marriage pact brokered, his descendants could very well end up ruling all of Rohan. Kind of conquest from within. This is one of those moments where I love to speculate on how the younger generation would have reacted to this proposal. As I've said, this entire story is told in about 2 pages of appendices, so we don't get any details, but surely Haleth and Hammer would have had thoughts about their sister potentially marrying the son of a man like Freca. Surely Helm's daughter herself would have had something to say, and her mother too. I imagine Frealoth would have had an opinion concerning his cousin's potential nuptials, but the truth is, we can only imagine what Helm's family made of Freca's offer. We can also only speculate on what Wulf made of all this. However, Tolkien does tell us how Helm himself reacted, and I think his response provides an interesting insight into his personality. It's hard to imagine other heroes of Middle-earth responding to Freca the way that Helm responded. So, unsurprisingly, I think, Helm said no. But he did so in a way that is both epic and hilarious, although with a little bit of hindsight also quite disastrous in the grand scheme of things. You see, in front of everyone in the Golden Hall, Helm mocks Freca and insults him for, of all things, being really fat. Tolkien does explicitly tell us that Freca was indeed wide in the belt, so Helm wasn't wrong, but still, and I'm no expert in diplomacy, but I'm under the impression that would be considered a faux pas. It certainly did not lead to an improvement in relations between Edoras and Freca's people. Freca responded to being publicly fat-shamed by the king by flying into a rage. He reviled King Helm, and when he was done with this angry criticism, he said something that is, in fairness to Freca, really quite badass. He approached King Helm, who is 63 at this moment in time, and he said, "Old kings that refuse a prophet's staff may fall on their knees." Now, Helm does not react immediately to this threat, I think would be the word, but he's certainly not happy about it. He says they'll discuss the marriage proposal later, but first they have matters of the moment to attend to. However, when the King's Council does come to an end, Helm does not return to the matter of marriage. Instead, he arises and he places one of his great hands on Freca's shoulder. He says to Freca, "The king does not permit brawls in his house, but men are freer outside." He then forces Freca to walk before him out of his hall, out of Edoras, and onto the plain that lies beyond the gate. And he tells Freca's men to remain where they are. Helm wants to speak to their lord alone. So, Helm and Freca walk together out of the capital into the field, and once there, Helm circles back to Freca's threat. He says, "Now, Dunlending, you have only Helm to deal with, alone and unarmed. You talk of a staff. If Helm dislikes a crooked staff that is thrust upon him, he breaks it, like so. Then Helm clenches a fist and he punches Freca so hard in the face that Freca dies. Right there, on the field before Edoras, the strength of Helm's bare hand strikes him as hard as a hammer, and thus, probably, Helm acquires his famous byname, Hammerhand. It's hard to say whether Helm intended to murder Freca in this moment, or if he simply threw a punch without knowing his own strength, but either way, Lord Freca is no more. His people must now take a new lord, and as it goes, that new lord turns out to be Wulf. After Freca's death, Helm declares that all of Freca's kin are enemies of Rohan, and Wulf is forced to return to his late father's lands to take command of his late father's warriors. I'm aware that Wulf is kind of the villain of this story, and I don't want to go over sympathizing with him. He is a bad guy. But at this moment in the story, he's not really done anything wrong, as far as we know, and there is a part of me that recognizes how frustrating this must be from his perspective. It's a real one of those expectation versus reality situations. Wulf went to Edoras under the expectation that he was going to become King Helm's future son-in-law. Instead, he ends up losing his own father, losing any opportunity of marrying into Helm's family, and being declared an enemy of Rohan by its king. As marriage proposals go, this one went badly. Wulf returned to his father's homestead with a great many men, a hatred of Helm, and an impulse towards vengeance. However, in order to tell the next part of this story, we're first going to have to turn our attention away from Edoras and the Rohirrim for a moment to take a brief look at what's going on in Gondor. You see, while everything I've been talking about was happening between Rohan and Dunland, Gondor and its enemies were involved in significant conflicts of their own. At this time, the steward of Gondor is a guy called Beren, and throughout Beren's reign, Gondor came under attack from one of their great enemies, the Corsairs of Umbar, effectively the pirates of Middle-earth. To be fair, the Corsair Wars have been raging for over 1,000 years by Beren's time, but every now and again, waves of this war intensify, and it just so happens that in the years following Freca's death and Wulf's exile, the Corsairs of Umbar launched their greatest attack in centuries. And they didn't just attack Gondor. 4 years after the death of Freca, far, far away in the south, 3 separate fleets of war set sail from the havens of Umbar. The first of these fleets is sent to harry the southern coastline of Gondor and to raid the Outlands. The second fleet is a little more mysterious, but from what we're told, my guess would be that it either sails or is rowed up the River Anduin, where it would make war upon Minas Tirith, Osgiliath, and probably Eastern Rohan. We know that Eastern Rohan is invaded at this time. We know Helm Hammerhand rides east to defend his land and subdue his enemy, and so I imagine, although we can't be certain, it's probably a part of this second Corsair fleet that King Helm is fighting. However, it is the third Corsair fleet that really matters to our story, because while Helm and his army rode east to battle, the third fleet from Umbar sailed all the way up to the mouth of the river Isen, and they continued upriver until it split into the Isen, which has its source in Isengard, and the Ardorn, where Wulf now rules his dead father's lands, just to the west of the Gap of Rohan. While the eyes and armies of King Helm are facing east, Wulf seizes his opportunity. He forges an alliance with the Corsairs, the enemies of Gondor, to make war upon the allies of Gondor, to bring down King Helm, avenge Lord Freca, and score a great win for the Dunlendings in their centuries-long conflict with Rohan. Now, just to reiterate one more time, the story of Helm is told in 2 pages, so we don't know much about the details of Wulf's rebellion, but we do know it was successful. Wulf kinda won, at least at first. In the Westfold, the remaining Rohirrim are defeated and their lands are overrun. Helm swiftly returns from the east to make war upon Wulf, but when he gets there, his tired army is driven back, and many of his riders are slain at the fords of Isen, the same place where Theodred, son of King Theoden, will also die fighting Dunlendings at the time of the Lord of the Rings. And this is a catastrophe for the people of Rohan. Many people of the Westfold are straight up murdered by Wulf's warriors, and many more are enslaved. Some do escape, but they're only able to do so by fleeing into the mountains or by seeking sanctuary in the glittering caves behind the ravine that will soon become known as Helm's Deep. For it is towards that valley that the king must now ride. He takes up sanctuary in the ancient Gondorian stronghold that his people call the Soothburg, and he seeks refuge there with both soldiers and civilians. Honestly, I have no idea whether his wife or daughter went with him to the Soothburg, but we do know that his second son, Hummer, certainly did. And we know that his firstborn son, his heir, did not. Nor did his nephew. Both Prince Haleth and his cousin, Freca Hilderson, remain in Edoras. I guess their duty is to defend the capital and to protect the Golden Hall of Meduseld from Dunlending invasion. Unfortunately though, this Golden Hall is what Wulf wants most. While his allies are besieging Helm's Deep, Wulf returns to Edoras. We don't know the full extent of how the fighting went down, but we do know by the time it was over, Edoras had fallen. Outside the doors of the Golden Hall, Prince Haleth fought the invaders sword to sword until he was the last man standing. But in the end, he alone was not enough. Haleth, son of Helm Hammerhand, heir to the kingdom of Rohan, was slain. Outside the very hall that he was one day set to inherit. And after he died, Wulf entered. He sat in Helm's chair and he declared himself the new king of the Mark. Rohan belonged to Dunlendings. However, we do know that some desperate people escaped Edoras, probably due to Haleth's self-sacrifice, and they were led by Freca Hilderson away from the capital and up into the naturally protected refuge of Dunharrow. And so that's basically it, right? Rohan is ruled by Wulf. Helm and his second son are still alive with a few warriors and a lot of innocent people in Helm's Deep, and Freca has managed to build another desperate sanctuary in the Highlands, but both Helm's Deep and Dunharrow are defensive strongholds. The enemy can't reach them there, but nor can they easily strike back against their enemy. This is arguably Rohan at its lowest low, until, in the months that follow, things get even worse. You see, soon after Wulf declares himself king, Middle-earth is plunged into an event that is remembered to history as the Long Winter. The Long Winter affects a lot of Middle-earth. It's not confined to the tale of Rohan, and we're actually told in other sources that one of the worst affected places during this time of bitter cold and darkness was the Shire. Fun fact, it was during the dreadful Long Winter that the wizard Gandalf first began to develop a warm place in his heart for hobbits. This is when he first took a serious interest in their well-being. If not for Gandalf's pity, and also the pity that hobbits showed for one another, perhaps they would not have survived the Long Winter. Anyway, back to the Rohirrim. Just imagine being one of those refugees shivering and starving in Helm's Deep. Or arguably even more brutal, imagine being one of the escapees who fled with Freca to Dunharrow. I suppose any sanctuary is better than death, but Dunharrow is not a fortress. It's just a level plain atop a high cliff hundreds of feet above the valley floor. There are no buildings there, no shelters save bare rock. Maybe Freca's people managed to take some tents with them, I doubt it. But either way, this must have been a phenomenally cruel winter, where famine and death stalked the land. But just because this is terrible news for the Rohirrim does not make it good news for the Dunlendings. They are starving too. They are freezing and dying and suffering grievously. The Long Winter actually does more damage to the Dunlendings than any king of Rohan ever could. And I know they're the bad guys, but spare some thought for the Corsairs of Umbar. Their home is in the sunny far south. They don't get winters like this. They sailed north to do war, and now they're experiencing a degree of cold and dearth and darkness that they probably never even imagined before. However, I suppose the suffering that I really should focus on is the suffering of Helm Hammerhand, because that's what's going to drive this story towards its conclusion. So put yourself in his shoes. He's just heard that his firstborn son has been slain. His land has been conquered, his own capital has fallen, and the golden hall of his ancestors is now occupied by the enemy. His people are freezing and starving and dying, and he is trapped inside a fortress under siege. And then things keep getting worse. By midwinter and the turning of the year, food was so scarce in Helm's Deep that the people of Rohan teetered on the brink of total ruin. And so, against the orders of his father and king, Helm's second son, his new heir, Prince Hammer, decided that he had no choice but to ride out of Helm's Deep and attempt to break this siege. I guess Hammer was of the opinion it is literally do or die. However, when Prince Hammer rode out from the Soothberg, he did not return, nor did any man that went with him. We don't know exactly how Hammer's sortie met their end, but the language Tolkien uses implies, at least to me, that they were killed by the winter rather than Dunlendings. All we know for certain, they were lost in the snow. And after the death of Hammer, Helm seems to undergo a really significant change. He now has no sons. The next king of Rohan might be Wulf's descendant, or it might be someone else from the House of Eorl, but it will not be Helm's son. His direct line ended with Hammer. You may be wondering, what about Helm's daughter? Didn't she survive the fell winter? Well, the truth is, we have no way of knowing. Although, I personally am kind of the opinion that this very tragic story might be more interesting if she dies too. Like, imagine a princess of Rohan compassionately offering her own food and her own blankets to these freezing civilians, and then perishing in their place due to the cold. I think that fits the themes of this grim story quite nicely, and it paints Helm's daughter as a heroic, self-sacrificing member of her family, just like her brothers. But that's just my speculation. Alternatively, maybe she did survive. But if she did, then we need to accept that she was not considered to succeed her father. Rohan has never had a ruling queen. Anyway, after a brutally miserable Yule where there is no celebration, the long winter continues for another 3 months, and the people in Helm's Deep continue to suffer and shiver and starve. But Helm Hammerhand is not the kind of king to die quietly. He came to Helm's Deep with an army and a war horn and hands that kill like hammers. By the latter half of the long winter, Helm's army is entirely diminished, but he still has his horn, and he still has his hands. And after the death of his sons, Helm grows so fierce and gaunt from famine and grief that his presence inspires an almost supernatural degree of dread in his enemies. Throughout the cold and the dark, Helm would often set out alone, departing the fortress dressed entirely in white and carrying no weapon save his bare fists, for it was believed that if Helm bore no weapon would bite him. He stalked the frozen land like a snow troll, appearing as a monster in the Dunlending camps and slaughtering many men with his bare hands. In fact, among the Dunlendings, rumours flew that whenever the king killed a man, he would eat him, and these rumours persisted in Dunland for generations. However, before the Dunlendings saw the Hammerhand seeming to appear out of the very snow, first they heard his horn. Every time he departed the Soothburg, the horn of Helm Hammerhand sounded in the deep, and the men of Dunland knew to be afraid. In the days that followed, the Soothburg became known as the Hornburg. And then, one night, after hearing a great many blasts of Helm's horn, the men sheltering in the Hornburg awoke to find that their king had not returned. Riders ventured into the valley to find their king, and in a rare gleam of sunlight, they did find him, standing in the snow, dressed all in white, facing the direction of his enemy, his knees unbent. But Helm Hammerhand was as lifeless as stone, frozen to death. In the end, the 9th King of Rohan was not killed by Dunlendings or Corsairs of Umbar, but by the cruelty of winter itself. However, fascinatingly, even after Helm's icy demise, still, it was said the sound of his horn could be heard echoing in Helm's Deep, and still the fear of him persisted. Before long, men were telling stories about the wraith of Helm Hammerhand, who supposedly still inhabited the deep and would still walk among the foes of Rohan, killing them with his weapon of fear. But that is the end of Helm Hammerhand's story. However, it is not quite the end of Wulf's rebellion. Throughout this ferocious winter, Wulf has sat in his golden hall, and the kingdom that he claimed has been locked in ice. There's no food, no warmth, no joy, only a cold and empty hall to remind the son of Freca that in truth he is the king of nothing. Until, eventually, the long winter finally came to an end. The weather broke, the snow melted, and when it did, Wulf and his remaining warriors learned that some things are even more dangerous than bad weather. Because even though Helm is dead, and Haleth is dead, and Hammer is dead, and maybe their sister is dead too, the house of Eorl the Young is not extinct. Helm had a sister, and Hild had a son. Frealaf survived his time in Dunharrow, he kept his people alive, and now winter is over. Vengeance is coming for Wulf. When the ice thawed, Frealaf Hilderson came down from Dunharrow with a small company of men behind him. They weren't enough to win a pitched battle, but Frealaf's plan relied on surprise. He returned to Edoras in secret, and within the Golden Hall of Meduseld, where Wulf cut down Prince Haleth, Frealaf killed Wulf. The Dunlending rebellion ends upon the point of Frealaf's sword. And that's, effectively, it. The long winter has levelled the playing field, and in the weeks and months that followed, Frealaf led what remained of his uncle Helm's riders against the invaders in the east, and then against the last of the Dunlendings in the west. The siege of the Hornburg was broken, the Corsairs of Umbar were expelled, and when the roads were finally cleared of ice and snow, a great army from Gondor came at last to Rohan's aid. Before the end of that year, the Dunlendings were driven back beyond the Gap of Rohan, and for the first time in centuries, Isengard was set free of Dunlending influence. The body of Helm Hammerhand was brought from the Hornburg and laid to rest with his ancestors in the Mound of the Kings. And forever afterwards, the snow-white flowers known as Cymbalmurna grew ever thickest on his burial mound. So that even in after days, it appeared that Helm Hammerhand's final resting place was still clad in snow. But now Rohan needs a new king, and that new king shall be Helm's sister's son, Frealaf, the guy who rescued Rohan. However, just because Rohan won doesn't mean things go straight back to normal. War and famine and winter have really done a number on the people and horses of this land, And it wasn't until the days of Freolaf's great-great-grandson that the Rohirrim finally bounced back to their former strength. But there is a fascinating little epilogue to this story, because on the very day that Freolaf Hildason was crowned king, a mysterious stranger arrived in Edoras, an old man, bearded, cloaked, and robed in white. No one knew his true identity, but they perceived that this wise man was greatly skilled in all kinds of arts that they themselves could not comprehend. So, in their language, they called him Man of Skill. An Old English word for skill, or design, or contrivance is Searu, so they called him Searu Man. Saruman. On the day of Freolaf's crowning, Saruman appeared in Rohan for the very first time, and he came bearing gifts and great praise for the people of Rohan, and everyone there thought him a friend. And the steward of Gondor did too. It was Steward Beren who gifted Saruman the keys to the Tower of Orthanc. He gave Saruman permission to take up residence in the now Dunlendingless Isengard. And so Saruman unlocked that tower that had not been entered in centuries, and he claimed the Palantir that everyone else had forgotten existed. Now, those of us who know how The Lord of the Rings goes are probably internally screaming at this moment. That was a bad decision. But neither Freolaf of Rohan nor Beren of Gondor had any reason to be suspicious. They both welcomed the White Wizard. They both believed this was an excellent stroke of good fortune. What could be better than knowing Isengard is under the protection of a powerful friend? What could be safer than letting Saruman guard the Westfold? To quote Tolkien on this, "A friend he long seemed, and maybe in the beginning he was one in truth, though afterwards his designs towards Rohan were evil. He then took Isengard for his own, and began to make it a place of guarded strength and fear, as though to rival the Barad-dûr. His friends and servants he drew from all who hated Gondor and Rohan, whether men or other creatures more evil." I guess the people of Western Rohan just cannot catch a break. Like, what's worse than a stronghold of Dunlendings on your doorstep? I don't know, how about a wizard committed to treason? No one, of course, could know it at the time, but because of Saruman's presence in Isengard, the wars of Rohan and Dunland are destined to continue for centuries to come. However, just before I finish, there's one last thing to say. Because, interestingly, when Freolaf Hildason eventually died, after 39 years as king, he was not buried in a burial mound beside his uncles, for he was not of Helm's line. He was the son of Helm's sister. So, when Freolaf is buried, a new line of king's mounds is begun, the line of the descendants of Freolaf. And Freolaf's direct line continues unbroken for 260 years. He's succeeded by his son, the beloved King Brutaleofa, then came King Valda, then King Folca, then Folquina, then a guy called Fengel, then a guy called Thengel, then a guy called Theoden. But just like Helm Hammerhand, King Theoden outlived his son. Theodred was supposed to succeed him, but Theodred was slain at the fords of Isen by Saruman's loyal Dunlendings. The crown passed instead to Theoden's sister son, to King Eomer. And when Eomer dies, 63 years after the Lord of the Rings, the men of Rohan begin a third line of burial mounds. And in the days of Eomer's son, Elfwine the Fair, Rohan prospers, its people thrive, and the machinations of Saruman are long washed away. The men of Rohan and the men of Dunland finally have peace. So, that's the tale of Helm Hammerhand. I hope you enjoyed it, thanks for watching, and if you did enjoy the video, be sure to hit like and leave a comment and click the subscribe button to make sure you don't miss any future videos coming soon. But, until next time, as always, my dear friends, much love, stay groovy, and Nevair Melanine.